Thank you all for standing by and welcome to our webinar entitled Our Wetlands, the Kidneys of the Landscape, the H2 Ohio Wetlands Monitoring Program. This webinar series called Freshwater Science will highlight Ohio Sea Grant and partnering scientists every month. Every quarter is a different focus from human health and fish farming to harmful algal blooms and human decision making, bringing applied research to the public on issues that affect our Lake Erie communities. I am Jill Gentis Banicki from Ohio Sea Grant and Stone Lab, and joining me today is Lauren Kinsman Costello from Kent State University. Dr. Kinsman Costello is an associate professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at Kent State University. She studies wetlands and how they work in a variety of settings, including the Alaskan Arctic and the Great Lakes region. Dr. Kinsman Costello is a research lead for the Ohio Department of Natural Resources funded H2 Ohio Wetlands Monitoring Program. We're delighted to have Dr. Kinsman Costello here to discuss her research. Before we do that, just a few mentions about the logistics of our wetlands. Of our webinar. During our presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. Afterwards, around 12:20-ish, I will conduct a question and answer session. If you'd like to ask a question during the presentation, please feel free to pull up that chat feature located at the bottom of your screen anytime during her talk, and I will collect and pose out your questions to Dr. Kinsman Costello at the end of her presentation. As a reminder, this webinar has auto captioning and is being recorded to be posted onto our website for later viewing. Also, we will post a webinar survey in the chat feature toward the end of the half an hour. Please take a few minutes after the webinar to fill out that survey. It always helps us continue to bring you great webinars. So without any further delay, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kinsman Costello presenting Our Wetlands, the Kidneys of the Landscape, the H2 Ohio Wetlands Monitoring Program.
Great. Thanks so much, Jill. And thanks to everybody for logging in at lunchtime and sharing the hour with me. I saw some familiar names on the participant list. So hi to everybody and welcome to those of you who I'm not familiar with or who are new to learning about the H2 Ohio Wetland Monitoring Program. So before we get into the details, this is going to be a review for a lot of the audience, but we still get some confusion about different aspects of the H2 Ohio program and where our monitoring program fits. So most folks in Ohio are probably familiar with the H2 Ohio Initiative, which is a state-funded comprehensive water quality improvement initiative that has been in place since about 2020. The goal is to improve water quality throughout the state of Ohio with a special focus on mitigating harmful algal blooms in the western basin of Lake Erie. And the state has identified a range of best management practices and actions that could be taken to improve water quality. And the actions are being distributed among these three main state agencies. So the Ohio Department of Agriculture is responsible for implementing financial incentives and improving management of on-farm practices. So there's a range of best management practices that they are facilitating, including nutrient reduction plans and cover crops and fertilizer placement improvements, a whole range of things on farm. The Ohio Environmental Protection Agency is working to improve septic systems and also upgrading drinking water distribution systems to mitigate lead in drinking water. And then finally, the Ohio Department of Natural Resources has invested in building out natural infrastructure that can improve water quality. And by natural infrastructure, we mean wetlands. So that is the portion of the H2 Ohio initiative that's relevant to the talk today, is the Ohio Department of Natural Resources Wetland Restoration Program. And to give a quick overview of that program, since 2019, the ODNR has embarked on this really impressive push to restore wetlands throughout the state of Ohio. So you'll notice that most of the projects are concentrated in the Maumee River watershed because of that initial focus on the western basin of Lake Erie. But to date, there's projects throughout the state and the majority of counties This map is not up to date. It's really hard to keep it up to date because the ODNR is moving so fast. To date, they have 183 wetland projects that are under contract. About 98 of those projects have been completed. They've restored lots of acres of wetland and invested a lot of money in restoration throughout the state. However, many of you have probably heard this phrase that wetlands are the kidneys of the landscape. Sometimes they're actually even shaped like kidneys, and this is because of the natural capacity wetlands can have to filter water. They slow water down, they promote biological processes, and by slowing things down and holding onto the water, sometimes that can remove different kinds of contaminants, including the nutrients that are a main focus of the H2 Ohio initiative. But there's some really important caveats to this that the ODNR has been aware of since they embarked on this wetland restoration program. So first of all, the ability of wetlands to filter nutrients is really variable. One wetland may be different from another wetland. Different zones within the same wetland can differ. And through time, an individual wetland ecosystem changes. So you've all probably seen different wetlands out there. They all look and feel very different. And the functionality of that wetland ecosystem is also variable. Sometimes wetlands can actually be a nutrient source rather than a sink. This is particularly relevant for phosphorus, especially when wetlands are restored on historically drained or historically cultivated lands. So a lot of very straightforward wetland restoration projects occur on formerly drained agricultural land that's poorly drained already, not producing great yields, could be great wetland habitat. And sometimes that's really effective, but at times those soils, because of the legacy of phosphorus that has accumulated in the soil, can, at least temporarily, become sources of phosphorus, and meaning it's exporting more phosphorus downstream than it's retaining within the wetland from upstream. And then finally, both nitrogen and phosphorus play really important roles in driving water quality impairments, harmful algal blooms, and eutrophic conditions. And there are some really important differences in how nitrogen and phosphorus cycle because they're chemically very different elements. So you can imagine that areas in a wetland that are really effective at nitrogen reduction might not have the features that are effective at phosphorus reduction and vice versa. So the ODNR was aware of this, and this leads to a really important question when you're comparing wetlands to all of the investments that the state is making, particularly focused on limiting phosphorus loads into water bodies. So the questions are, is this actually a cost-effective method given how variable phosphorus removal by wetlands is? Is this worthwhile BMP to invest dollars in? And then given that there is variability and some wetlands, we have really strong evidence that they are very effective, how can the ODNR and other managers make choices that optimize that nutrient removal function while hopefully getting all of the additional benefits that wetlands can provide when they're restored on the landscape? So to answer these questions, the ODNR has turned to a group of researchers that are members of the Lake Erie and Aquatic Research Network. So we are the Wetlands and Water Quality Research Group. We are academic researchers from 6 universities throughout the state of Ohio, and I lead this team of faculty, students, and staff in developing and implementing a program to address these questions. Now, many of you might already be familiar with the monitoring that wetland restoration and construction entails. There are some really well-established and well-developed large-scale monitoring programs for wetlands that have been established because of the way wetland use and building is regulated through the Army Corps of Engineers and the Clean Water Act. And so most of those monitoring frameworks are really aimed at assessing regulatory compliance, assessing whether or not a contract to implement a wetland project was completed as planned, and general indicators of the health and integrity of the ecosystem. So one really strong program is the Great Lakes Coastal Wetland Monitoring Program that's aimed at that kind of thing. Most of these monitoring programs are based largely on really visible wetland features. So just features of wetland habitat like wetland hydrology, wetland plants, wetland soils, biodiversity, things that give us a good kind of ranking. In Ohio, there's a 1, 2, 3 system to designate wetlands as high, medium, or low kind of quality. Baked into these assumptions are that the invisible functions that we can't directly see with our eyes, but we know wetlands can do are happening, right? So there's this assumption that wetlands, if you build it and it looks like a wetland, it's going to be removing nitrogen and phosphorus. And that once you build that wetland and you monitor it, maybe 1 or 2 years after the restoration was completed, that functionality will be stable through time, which anybody who's watched an ecosystem for more than a year knows that ecosystems are not stable. They vary a lot over short and long time scales. So given the large investment that the state is making in wetlands, given the very specific focused goal of nutrient reduction, the ODNR and us researchers are trying to develop a monitoring program that more directly gets at these invisible nutrient removal functions. So that means our goals are kind of two-pronged: assessment and action, right? So the H2 Ohio Wetland Monitoring Program, which is independent from the ODNR, but we do work with the ODNR to ensure that our priorities are aligning with the questions that the ODNR has. Our goals are to assess the nutrient removal function as directly as we can of wetland projects that are being implemented as part of the H2 Ohio program, and to inform as we go the ODNR wetland restoration program as they continue to make decisions to fund future projects and inform the design of future wetland projects and management of future wetland projects. So I mentioned earlier that there's some inherent differences in nitrogen and phosphorus, and I just want to remind folks of that because it is really relevant in this framework. So when nitrogen and phosphorus get into a wetland, one of the most conspicuous ways that the wetland can prevent those nutrients from going downstream is just through plant uptake, right? Any gardener, farmer, anybody who has grown a plant and tried to grow it bigger knows that when plants take nitrogen and phosphorus up out of the soil and they build themselves with it. So now a lot of that nitrogen and phosphorus is in plant material instead of in a form that can move further downstream. Now, even though this is a temporary storage component, because plants can die and those nutrients can be remineralized, it can take up and store a lot of nutrients, at least temporarily, and it can change the form of the nutrients into one that is less available for algae to take up. Now, it is temporary, and so there are two other really important kinds of processes that remove nitrogen and phosphorus, and they take place in the mud, which is where I like to hang out as a wetland sediment biogeochemist. So first of all, microbes in the soil can change nitrogen through a process called denitrification into a gaseous form. So that is considered a net removal from the system. That nitrogen that gets up in the air is not going downstream and feeding harmful algal blooms at all once it gets back into the atmosphere. Phosphorus, on the other hand, doesn't have a major gas component, so it either sticks to the soil through sorption processes or phosphorus that's already associated with particles that's carried in on sediment in turbid waters. If that can settle out and become buried, then that can be a storage mechanism for phosphorus. Now, what that means is you do have phosphorus sometimes accumulating in these wetland soils, and so that's why considering both sink and potential source behavior is important when we're thinking about what's happening inside a wetland to remove nutrients. As important, if not more so, than understanding the processes that happen inside a wetland is appreciating the fact that each one of those processes is really variable in space and time. Different kind of plants will take up and store a different amount of nutrients. The nature of the soil really affects how much it can denitrify and how much phosphorus it can store. And then on top of that, the degree of connection to nutrient sources, if you're just looking at a balance sheet, thinking about a wetland like a bank account, if there isn't any money going into the bank, then the bank cannot build up savings. And if the money goes through the bank really fast and you just spend it again, it also can't build up savings. So there's this trade-off, and there's this really important role that the connection of the nature of the connection of the wetland to the landscape has on the total amount of nutrients that that wetland can store. If there aren't any nutrients going into the wetland in the first place, it isn't going to have as large of an effect as a wetland that is maybe right on the edge of a field or downstream of a agricultural tributary. And if the water isn't stored on the wetland and it just leaves again, then it also doesn't have a very strong capacity to store nutrients. So generally, I'm going to give you some more specific results, but this is an important take-home message that all of the specific early results we've gotten from the monitoring program affirm. So one very unique and powerful feature of the ODNR's program is not only are there a lot of wetlands that are being restored, but the approaches are incredibly diverse. So no ecosystem ecologist, if you went to them and said, hey, design a science experiment to tell me if wetlands are effective at removing nutrients, no one would design an experiment like this because there's no true replication. But what's awesome about this is how wetland restoration is really being done in different parts of the state. The ODNR is not prescribing specific frameworks or designs. They're moving towards improving their guidance, but it provides the full range of actual as-built projects for us as a monitoring program to assess and give really impactful and relevant information about how effective these different approaches are. So some projects are coastal reconnections where they're historically diked wetlands that have been disconnected from their watersheds, and the restoration activity is to reconnect those wetlands to the watershed. So this example that I'm showing you here is McGee Marsh. Turtle Creek is an agricultural watershed. It's a portion of McGee Marsh, sorry. Turtle Creek is a tributary that runs adjacent to one of the dikes, and they built new control structures that allow some of the water from Turtle Creek to be diverted into the wetland to hopefully remove some of those nutrients before the water is discharged back out into Lake Erie. So there are several coastal reconnection projects like that. There are some projects that are floodplain projects that flood and they're adjacent to a larger river or flow path. And so when they flood, the wetland floods and presumably holds on to some of that water and those nutrients before the water re-enters the flow. Many of the projects, as I mentioned earlier, are on historically drained agricultural land, which have potentially the highest potential for enough nutrient sourcing to have a really big impact, but also a unique feature is they're heavily influenced by tile drainage and engineers' drainage networks, so that poses some unique features and some monitoring challenges as well. And then there are several that look really like almost engineered treatment trains that seem to kind of borrow from an urban stormwater treatment playbook as well. So we have this really wide range of features and approaches to wetland restoration. We know we can never monitor all of them, so we take a tiered approach. The actual data we collect is kind of tiered, where we don't monitor all of the projects. Currently, as of next year, we'll be monitoring 45 in total of the completed H2 Ohio projects. And we do a baseline monitoring that we think of like as taking a wetlands vital sign. So we're looking at how deep the water is and how that changes over time, the nutrients dissolved in the water that we sample periodically, and the nutrient features of the soil that we sample at least once a year. So I like to describe this as being similar to a doctor who just takes your temperature and they can tell you whether or not you have a fever, but they can't necessarily tell you why you are or are not healthy. In a subset of these projects, which we call focal projects, we intensively monitor and throw everything we can at them to get the best estimate of nutrient removal that we can using a variety of different data collection techniques. And we select projects that are representative of commonly used restoration approaches or have features that are of specific interest. So this not only gives us better empirical measurements of nutrient retention, but it also gives us an understanding of what's going on inside that wetland. What are the mechanisms of nutrient removal? So it kind of feels like we just got started, but we are now in year 5 of the monitoring program. One very exciting milestone that we reached in the spring was we released the first annual report that contains summarized data from our first full year of data collection. So the 2023 water year, last year, was the first year that we collected sufficient data where we had a full year of data. If you scan this QR code, or I believe Jill is putting a link in the chat function, that you can link and download this entire report and see all of our summarized data from 2023. And another one will be coming out in 2024. I know we're short on time. I'm just going to give you a little taste of our early results. What I'm going to show you is in 8 of the H2 Ohio projects, we felt like we had sufficient data to estimate the net nutrient removal for these projects based on some empirical data. The way we did this calculation is different for every single one of these projects because every single one of these projects is so different. But every estimate is based on some kind of empirical data that we collected. So it's slightly better, in some cases much better, than just a benchtop based estimate based on information we can get from, say, maps or design plans. So all of these numbers and the way that we calculated them are in that annual report. So you don't need to pay attention to the values of these numbers. But what I do want to point out is that most of these projects, most of the time, retain both nitrogen and phosphorus on annual timescales. So when you add up for the whole year, they are preventing nitrogen and phosphorus from moving downstream. The amount that they are doing varies from 0 to about 10 pounds per acre for phosphorus. That 0 is the one that we have the highest certainty on, in fact, because that's that coastal reconnection project where the water level control structures were closed all of 2023. So there was no water from Turtle Creek going into the wetland because they were doing a dike construction project. The reason I tell you that is to highlight that we still have a lot of knowledge gaps, especially in terms of what land is draining into some of these projects because of the complexities of tile drain inputs and challenges of sampling during storm events, which sadly still don't check my Outlook calendar. I keep asking them to just happen when it's convenient for us to sample them. So we're building out different autonomous approaches to help us capture those storm events in the future. And even in 2024, we did a much better job. So our take-home messages, our early results in brief are that projects are removing on a range of 0 to 10 pounds of phosphorus per acre, but that's really variable and there are a lot of uncertainties in these estimates. We're going to continue monitoring them and hope to continue monitoring them for years into the future. And that when you compare these numbers to other best management practices, it becomes clear that wetlands can be a really important tool in this multi-pronged approach to mitigating phosphorus loads. They're probably never going to be the only thing that we can and should do for a lot of reasons, but they're impactful enough that they can be a very relevant tool. And in the future, we'll do even more of that cost-benefit analysis as we collect more data. And we're going to share some of these results in more detail coming up in a webinar in December. So today I was told to keep it to 15 minutes. I'm already way over that, so that we had time for more question and answers. But if you're interested in more details, there's more to come in this December webinar. And I just wanted to acknowledge the amazing team that I'm working with and say thanks to you all for being here. Thanks to all the partners that let us access their wetlands and give us information. And of course, to the ODNR, the Ohio Water Development Authority, the US EPA, and the Ohio Department of Higher Education, all who have funded different aspects of our work in the monitoring program. So I'm happy to answer any questions that folks want to share right now.
All right. Well, we've gotten quite a few questions. I did put in the chat both the URL for the Learn website that has the report, 2-pager wetland case studies, all the information dealing that Dr. Kinsman Costello just mentioned. I also put in the registration for the webinar that is on December 4th. So everyone would have that as well. So you should be all ready for that.
Great.
So let me ask you, and we've gotten quite a few questions in the chat. So let me get to those first.
Sure.
Um, and sorry, I'm like switching screens here. So let me just double check I've got. Okay. First question is, given all the fine work that you and others are doing, are you able to estimate how long it will be before phosphorus abatement programs reduce phosphorus load to Lake Erie to end harmful algal blooms?
That's a good question. I'll add that our piece of answering that question is one small piece. Um, and I think estimates of the amount of time that it would take to do that could be brought together at any time point. And the longer we monitor each of these approaches, the more accurate those estimates will be. I think some of the numbers that we're generating right now could absolutely contribute to that, but especially with wetlands, the long-term monitoring is going to be really key because not only do newly built wetlands in places with legacies of phosphorus use have a potential for releasing phosphorus, wetlands that have been built and are accumulating phosphorus over time also have a vulnerability to becoming saturated, essentially. They're accumulating phosphorus in the soil, accumulating it, and at a certain time, there may be an equilibrium that shifts where the soil is no longer able to accumulate phosphorus. It begins releasing phosphorus. And approaches to addressing that in the past have been things like dredging the wetlands to kind of reset them, or moving that surface layer of soil, but that can be really ecologically intensive. So the short answer is we could do that. We aren't the only people who would need to be a part of answering that question, but that all of these things are going to take a lot of time just because of the inherent nature of the processes that happen in soils and ecosystems.
All right, thank you. We had a couple people ask if you wouldn't mind going back to the results slide to view.
Absolutely. I will, but I will add all of these results. If you just download that report, there is an executive summary that has a much more useful table with all of these values in it. So you will not have to dig to find these values, but yes, here they are again.
All right, perfect.
Yep.
All right, so another question that we got was, on any of your sites, do you measure volumetric flow for annual input and output
Yep.
of phosphorus loading?
Wherever we can, that's what we're doing. The approach to measuring flow is variable at different sites. In ones where there is consistent flow at the inflow and the outflow, it is challenging but straightforward and takes time to calibrate the right kind of sensors. In sites where inflows and outflows are either really intermittent or cryptic, it is even harder. And we're working towards that in all of our, especially the focal projects. So for example, the Burntwood Langenkamp Wetland Conservation Area that you see here, that's one that has more persistent flow, where we've been able to more accurately estimate volumetric inflows and outflows than some of the others. So basically the status of measuring volumes in and volumes out and the way we measure them for these projects is outlined in that annual report. And every year our ability is going to improve as we improve our sensor systems and collect more data under different kinds of hydrologic conditions.
All right. Another question we got was, and let me just read it verbatim here. I assume it varies by wetland, but is most of the nutrient being removed in the particulate form due to settling? Is the first question.
Yes, most of the time in most wetlands for phosphorus, the majority of phosphorus removal on a mass basis, mass of the element P being removed, will be through sediment settling, with only a fraction of what we call the soluble or dissolved reactive phosphorus, the phosphate. but we're still interested in both because of how bioavailable phosphate is and how that is the form of phosphorus that directly fuels algal blooms.
All right. Next question in this little clump here. Are dissolved nutrients only removed by plant intake?
No. So for dissolved nitrogen, microbes can transform that nitrogen. So like probably the most important nitrogen removal mechanism is the transformation of nitrate to nitrogen gas by denitrifying microorganisms. Plants play indirect roles in that, but really it's all about those bacteria that are essentially breathing nitrate instead of oxygen when oxygen is not available in the soil. Phosphate is the other kind of dissolved nutrient that plants may take up. Phosphate is a very sticky ion because of its charge and the charge of minerals in the soil. So phosphate can sorb to soils, and that's one way that soils and sediments can remove it. But that sorption process is really reversible. So under some conditions, sorption can pretty rapidly switch to desorption. And that's that kind of transient phosphorus release event that we're really surveilling for in some of our systems.
All right. And then last question in this little clump here. Do you use residence time to characterize wetlands, and does this affect nutrient removal?
Residence time absolutely influences nutrient removal. I mentioned earlier that sort of balance of connecting to a nutrient source, but also holding on to the water long enough. So in most situations, the longer the water stays in a wetland, the more time those processes have to work. And so typically longer residence times confer greater nutrient removal capacity. That's not always true, but most of the time it is. Calculating residence times depends on the kind of hydrologic data that the earlier question asked. So it's something we're moving towards. We don't have enough data in enough of our projects to go across the board and calculate residence time for each and every one so we can compare. But we'll start to do that for individual projects now that we've started to collect enough hydrologic data. And eventually we'll have a database of that as sort of a feature that we can hopefully optimize for nutrient removal.
All right. I had a couple people ask for the link again for the report, so I'm going to put that
Great.
in here.
Download it. If we had more time, we would have written less. A lot of pages.
Another question we had, and I'm sorry, now I'm getting all these questions, so now it's going, I'm having to dig here. Do wooded wetlands have the ability to sequester phosphorus for longer time periods?
I don't know if we have the data yet to compare wooded wetlands to unwooded wetlands. Most of these projects, because they are relatively new, if they're intended to be wooded wetlands, the trees aren't very big yet. So it's something we'd have to watch over time. And most of the relict wooden wetlands, there aren't very many that remain in Ohio, aren't connected to the landscape in the same way as these projects would be. So that would be a question we'd have to explore in the future. I mean, trees generally, they're bigger, they'll store more nutrients in them. But when you kind of add up that balance sheet of accounting, I'm not sure.
Okay.
A good question.
3 more questions, I think, here.
Okay.
Are site conditions and limitations like cultural resources, topography, hydrology, Lake Erie water levels, are all those taken into consideration when determining potential nutrient loading requirements?
I would say, I mean, anything that's taken into consideration when embarking on a typical wetland restoration, which those are all things that every wetland restoration project I'm familiar with would take into account, is taken into account in this process. I and us at the monitoring program, we are not directly involved in selecting project sites, in designing projects, and deciding funding. That is all the ODNR's decision making, and then we monitor what has already been funded. We are starting to give them some guidance and tell them things that we've learned and look at some of their proposals to give them feedback on what may or may not be effective, but most of those questions would be better asked to the folks at the ODNR and then all of the partners that they work with, who are the people who actually design and implement the wetland projects, different land conservancies, metro parks districts, groups like that.
All right. Are you measuring, and sorry, we're getting a lot of detailed questions here.
Fine, bring it.
Are you measuring things like dissolved oxygen or pH levels and other things that could affect nutrient take up and release?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The tricky thing with measuring some of those things is they require water to be there. And a lot of wetlands aren't wet all of the time. So places that have persistent flooding, especially in the focal projects, we deploy continuously logging sensors that measure those things, that are calibrated and all of that. Places where the water is intermittent, we have every time we collect a water sample, we measure those physical chemical parameters like dissolved oxygen and pH. And that's getting at our goal of not only understanding the net effect of each of these projects, but understanding the mechanisms that are happening in the wetland.
All right. I have two more questions. Sorry. I keep saying I have only three and then I add one.
Keep them on. It's fine. We've got plenty of time.
Are the percent removal rates fairly consistent?
No, we don't. We have percent removal rates, I think, reported in the annual report. And in some cases, the net retention it's not relevant to display it or report it as a percent removal because there's not a clear inflow outflow where it's okay it's really difficult to constrain at least the total inflow in some cases. So because the main goal, especially in the context of phosphorus, is an actual quantified load reduction. So there's the 40% of the load in, I can't remember what the baseline year is. So the ODNR has specific targets for load reduction, not percent reduction. So that's our focus is on quantifying actual mass reduced instead of percent reduction. But if we went and looked at percentages, they would also be just as variable as the mass removed.
All right. Last question. We had several people asking, what is the hope that what will ODNR use this information for? And have they started doing some tweaking of things? Could you talk a little bit about that?
That's such a great question. The hope is that the ODNR, because the program is still going, they're still restoring wetlands, and they want to improve. They want every dollar that they spend on a wetland, they want to feel confident that they have done everything they can to ensure they're funding the projects that are going to best achieve their goals with a priority on phosphorus removal. They are also interested in projects that provide additional co-benefits, but the policy framework and the context of this funding is really focused on phosphorus removal. So they are prioritizing projects that remove that. We meet with the ODNR almost weekly to share the kinds of results that we are finding and seeing in real time and to calibrate our efforts to align our priorities with their priorities. And this year, a very concrete way that they have incorporated feedback from our results is they invited some researchers on the monitoring program to sit on a panel reviewing some of the wetland proposals that they get. So the way the ODNR chooses wetland projects to fund is entities throughout the state put together proposals and submit them to the ODNR to request support to implement the projects. So we helped the ODNR review them and gave them information based on these results that we've seen here on what kind of features would or would not promote different degrees of nutrient retention. And so they're taking that feedback from us and incorporating it into their next round of funding decisions. And our understanding is that they're going to continue to do that.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
thank you. This was perfect. This was a good way of ending this webinar.
Absolutely. Yeah. Hopefully
Um,
folks who wanted more details can log in December, because we'll have more time and more. We still won't be able to get to everything. We never can. But if anybody has questions, they can contact me and I can get them in the right direction.
Oh, perfect. Perfect. And I'll put that link into the email that goes out to everyone with this recording. So this is perfect. So let me just close here. I want to thank you, Dr. Kinsman Costello, for your willingness to talk to us today about this great initiative. We really appreciate it. It was really an excellent discussion. I also wanted to remind everyone that our survey URL for this webinar is in the chat feature, so please take a few minutes to fill that out. This webinar series is sponsored by Ohio Sea Grant and will continue in October with Ohio Sea Grant Extension's Nicole Wright, who will be talking all about Ohio aquaculture. The registration link is also in the chat. So I want to, again, thank you, Dr. Kinsman Costello. This was really a great presentation. It was such great information. We really appreciate also the participants' questions, some really great ones. We hope that this was beneficial, and we hope that you'll join us again in an upcoming webinar. Thanks again, Dr. Kinsman Costello. This was really great, and hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.